At 9:42 this morning, something happened that has never occurred in 235 years of American constitutional history. A federal judge didn't fine Donald Trump. She didn't lecture him. She didn't send a strongly worded letter through his lawyers. She signed a court order that reached straight into the Oval Office and stripped specific executive powers from a sitting president, suspended them, removed them from his hands while he still sat behind the resolute desk. This wasn't politics. This wasn't a normal legal dispute that could be spun away on cable news. This was a constitutional reckoning delivered with cold, clinical precision. And it happened before most Americans had even finished their first cup of coffee. Markets collapsed within 11 minutes. The Senate went into emergency session. International networks broke into regular programming. Somewhere inside the White House, between the gold-plated furniture and the framed magazine covers, someone had to walk into the most powerful office in the world and tell the man sitting there that a judge had just taken something from him and he couldn't get it back. This is how a presidency unravels, when a man who spent his entire life believing that laws were for other people finally meets a judge who disagrees. Tonight, we map exactly how Donald Trump's own arrogance and contempt for the rule of law made this moment inevitable and why this may be the beginning of the end of his unchecked power. 7 days ago, this was still just a subpoena. Judge Katherine Torres ordered Donald Trump to produce financial documents connected to an investigation into the alleged misuse of emergency powers. It was routine federal court business, the kind of order courts issue hundreds of times a year across this country. Trump had every normal, professional option available. He could have negotiated a reasonable production schedule. He could have released some documents and contested others in good faith. He could have played the game of legal procedure the way every previous president and virtually every other defendant in American history has done. Instead, Donald Trump chose war. On day one, his lawyers claimed blanket executive privilege over every single document Judge Torres requested. Not some documents, not most documents, every single one, every page, every line, every number. It was a legal argument so sweeping, so breathtaking in its arrogance, that the judge rejected it the same afternoon. Before the first day even ended, this was no longer a discovery dispute. It was a direct, open challenge to the authority of the federal judiciary itself, issued by a president who clearly believes the courts exist to serve him, not to constrain him. By day 3, the compliance deadline had passed and Trump had produced nothing. Not one sheet of paper, not a single page. Judge Torres issued a contempt finding against a sitting president of the United States. A federal contempt charge was entered into the official record. Trump's team immediately appealed, not because they had a strong case, but because delay has always been Donald Trump's only real legal strategy. Stall, appeal, attack the judge by name. File motions he knows will fail just to burn another 48 or 72 hours. It's a tactic that worked for him for decades when he was a private citizen, and judges were just obstacles to be outlasted or bullied. On day 5, the appeals court upheld the contempt finding unanimously. 3 judges, 0 dissent. They didn't just disagree with Trump's privilege argument, they eviscerated it, calling it overbroad and unsupported by precedent. In plain American English, you made this up. Every court that has looked at this case has reached the same conclusion. Trump's team argued that the law gave them protections it has never actually given anyone in the history of this country. Then came day 7 today. Judge Torres didn't just hold Trump in contempt again. She reached across a constitutional boundary that had remained uncrossed for 2.5 centuries. She suspended his authority. She took the power itself away. 7 days. 7 days of Donald Trump's legal team choosing confrontation over cooperation at every single turn, not because they had a winning argument, but because in Donald Trump's world, delay, obstruction, and attacks on judges are the only moves he knows. He stalls, he appeals, he attacks, he files losing motions to buy time. It worked when judges were just another problem to be managed. But Judge Katherine Torres was never just another judge. She was a wall. And every time Trump's team threw themselves against that wall in their arrogant belief that they could outlast her, she moved it 3 steps closer. Each day of defiance gave her more legal justification. Each refusal, Each contempt finding, each rejected appeal, stacked on top of the previous one until this morning, when the stack became something that has no name in any American legal textbook. This is the story of a man who has never in his life been told no by anyone who could actually make it stick. And what happens the day that finally changes because of his own reckless, lawless choices? If you can already see how Donald Trump's decades of arrogance and contempt for the law turned a routine subpoena into a constitutional earthquake, drop a comment right now and tell me when you realized he was never going to respect the courts. Hit like if you're done watching one man treat the entire justice system like an inconvenience he can simply ignore, and subscribe to American Flashpoint today so you're here when the next wall comes down. Page 47, paragraph 3. Buried inside a 9-4-page federal court ruling that most cable news anchors will never read and most White House lawyers probably wish didn't exist, Judge Katherine Torres wrote 5 words that detonated like a shaped charge beneath the foundation of the American presidency. Presidential authority is hereby suspended, not limited, not challenged through normal channels, not referred to a higher court for further review, suspended, removed from his hands entirely until he complies. That word 5 letters, 2 syllables represents something that has no parallel, no precedent, no reference point in the entire history of this republic. Constitutional scholars who have spent their careers studying the limits of executive power read that sentence and went silent. Then they started making phone calls. A Harvard law professor called it the most significant judicial assertion of power over the executive branch since Marbury versus Madison in 1803. A former Supreme Court clerk said this ruling goes further than anything Richard Nixon faced during Watergate, and Nixon was facing possible criminal indictment while still in office. Let that sink in. Here is what makes this categorically different from every judicial confrontation with a sitting president in 235 years of American history. When courts challenged Nixon, they ordered him to produce evidence. When courts challenged Clinton, they ordered him to testify. When courts have challenged presidents across more than 2 centuries, the mechanism has always been the same. The court commands, do this, stop doing that, produce this document, appear before this body. In every single one of those cases, presidential authority remained untouched. The president still held his powers. The court was managing how he used them, not removing them. Judge Torres did something that belongs in a completely different category. She didn't order Donald Trump to do anything. She didn't tell him what he couldn't do. She reached into the executive branch and removed the power itself, suspended it, took it out of his hands and locked it away pending compliance. Compelling a president is telling a powerful man to exercise his power differently. Stripping a president is telling him the power is no longer his. One is a directive, the other is a seizure. That distinction is why 5 lines on page 47 triggered an immediate constitutional crisis that nobody in Washington, in either party, in any branch, knows how to resolve. And Donald Trump's legal team, when they read those 5 words, they filed an emergency stay request at 10:18 a.m., then another at 10:31, then another at 10:47. 3 emergency filings in 65 minutes. That's not legal strategy. That's the legal equivalent of a man on fire running in circles because his own arrogance finally caught up with him. They had no precedent to cite, no case law to reference, because a situation like this has never existed until Donald Trump's own contempt for the judicial process created it. He thought he was fighting a judge. He was writing constitutional law, and his name will be attached to it forever. The legal ground just moved under Donald Trump in a way his arrogance never allowed him to imagine. If you want to understand exactly how much damage his lawless behavior has done to his own power, keep watching. And if you believe no president should ever be allowed to treat the courts like an optional suggestion, hit that like button and subscribe to American Flashpoint today, right now. What happened in the 90 minutes after that ruling dropped is more alarming than the ruling itself. 9:42 a.m. Judge Torres signs the order. Donald Trump's specific executive powers are now legally suspended. 9:48 a.m. 6 minutes later, the White House releases a formal legal statement. You cannot draft, review, and clear a calibrated response to an unprecedented constitutional strike in 6 minutes. That statement was pre-written, staged, ready before Judge Torres even signed her name, which means the White House knew this was coming. They had intelligence on their own legal defeat. They prepared for the loss. They loaded the response before the ruling dropped, and they still couldn't stop it. That is not the behavior of a man who believes he's going to win. That is the behavior of a man who has already accepted defeat and is now desperately managing the optics of humiliation. 9:53 a.m. 11 minutes after the ruling, the financial markets begin to move. The S&P 500 drops 2.8% in 20 minutes. The Dow falls 847 points. Trading volume spikes 340% above the daily average. Trillions of dollars of institutional money, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, pension portfolios, all processing the same signal at the same speed and reaching the same conclusion. Something has gone structurally wrong in Washington because of Donald Trump's defiance. Markets don't do political theater. They move on risk, and they move fast and hard. 10:04 a.m., the Senate Majority Leader calls an emergency caucus. Senators are physically pulled from committee hearings mid-sentence. 10:11 a.m. The House Speaker announces a bipartisan leadership meeting for that afternoon, both parties, both chambers. The last time something like that was convened outside a national security emergency was the morning after September 11th, 10:18 a.m. Trump's legal team files their first emergency stay request, then a second at 10:31, then a third at 10:47. 3 emergency filings in 65 minutes, each one designed not to win an argument, but to slow a clock they were already losing because of their clients' reckless decisions. 10:57 a.m., BBC breaks into regular programming, Reuters issues a global alert, Al Jazeera runs a special bulletin, international media does not interrupt scheduled broadcasts for American political disputes. They interrupt when they see a Western democracy may be experiencing institutional failure caused by one man's lawlessness. 11:12 a.m. 90 minutes after 9:42 a.m. Every major institution in American public life is in emergency mode. Congress is in session. Markets are in freefall. 3 foreign news agencies have broken their regular programming. Trump's legal team is on their 3rd emergency filing. And somewhere in a federal courthouse, Judge Katherine Torres is already preparing for the possibility that Donald Trump will refuse to comply even with this 90 minutes. That's all it took for one court order to push the most powerful country in the world to the edge of institutional crisis, all because Donald Trump decided the rules didn't apply to him. This isn't one story. It's 3 running in parallel, accelerating toward the same collision point, each one feeding the others. And the one nobody's covering yet is the most dangerous, created entirely by Donald Trump's refusal to accept any limits on his power. Track 1, judicial enforcement. Judge Torres issued the ruling. It's legally binding. But here lies the darkest structural paradox in the entire American system. A federal judge has no army. The U.S. Marshals Service executes federal court orders. The Marshals report to the Attorney General. The Attorney General reports to the President. The enforcer is controlled by the target. Judge Torres anticipated this exact problem because she understands who she is dealing with. Her ruling includes a provision authorizing direct enforcement through the federal judiciary's own officers if executive branch agencies refuse to comply. She didn't wait to see if Donald Trump would honor the rule of law. She built a backup for when he tries to break it. The fact that a federal judge had to build a workaround for the possibility that the president would refuse to honor a court order tells you exactly where Donald Trump has brought this country through his arrogance and lawlessness. Track 2, Congress. The House Judiciary Committee was already constructing an impeachment case before this morning's ruling. This ruling didn't just accelerate that timeline, it detonated it. Proceedings that were weeks from a vote are now potentially hours away. Members who were publicly saying, let the courts handle it, are now saying privately, the courts handled it, he still won't comply. Watch the silence from Republican leadership. When longtime allies of a president stop making public statements, when the defense goes quiet, that's not confusion, that's calculation. That's people deciding which side of history they want to be on before the door closes on Donald Trump's lawless behavior. Track 3, the one no one is covering yet, inside the executive branch itself. Something is fracturing because of Donald Trump's choices. Cabinet members and agency heads across every department are waking up to a legal reality nobody prepared them for. They may be personally liable. Every agency head who follows a presidential directive that a federal court has ruled is legally suspended is potentially in contempt of court. Not Trump, them, by name, individually. The people Trump appointed are being asked to choose between their boss and the law, and choosing their boss may mean criminal exposure for themselves. This isn't a political question for those officials anymore. It's a personal legal liability question created entirely by Donald Trump's refusal to accept limits on his power. These three tracks don't run independently. They feed each other. If judicial enforcement fails because executive agencies refuse to comply, impeachment becomes the only viable mechanism. If impeachment accelerates, the cabinet crisis deepens. If the cabinet fractures, enforcement becomes viable again through a different channel. Three pressure systems, all tightening simultaneously. 72 hours on the clock, all because one man believed he was above the law. Let's be precise about where actual power sits right now. Judge Katherine Torres is, at this moment, the single most consequential legal figure in the United States. She issued a ruling with no precedent. She anticipated executive resistance from a president who thinks rules are for other people and built enforcement contingencies directly into the order before Trump's team filed their first appeal. Every time Trump's legal team escalated in their arrogant belief they could outmaneuver her, she was already 3 moves ahead. Her limitation is that she has no direct enforcement arm. Her strength is that she doesn't need one if institutions choose law over loyalty to Donald Trump. So far, her strategy has been methodical and flawless. Trump's legal team is in visible freefall. 3 emergency stays in 65 minutes is not legal strategy, it's legal panic from a team whose client's lawlessness left them with nothing. They've lost at the trial court level, the contempt hearing level, and the appeals court level. Every single judicial body that examined this case ruled against them. They have no winning argument left because they chose confrontation over cooperation at every single decision point and burned every option they had. Their remaining choices have collapsed to 2. Comply and formally acknowledge that courts hold authority over the president, or continue defying and face escalating enforcement action against a sitting president. Every other door closed this week, and Donald Trump's team is the one who closed them through their own arrogance. Congressional Republican leadership is fractured in a way that hasn't been visible since the first impeachment. Some members are still publicly defending Trump's position mechanically, without conviction. Others went completely silent this morning. That silence is the tell. When allies stop talking, it means they've already decided. And they don't want to be on record when the verdict comes on Donald Trump's lawless behavior. The Attorney General sits at the intersection of the most impossible position in American government created by Trump's own actions. Legally obligated to enforce federal court orders. Politically appointed by the president, those orders target, enforce the ruling, betray Trump and face political consequences. Refuse to enforce, face personal contempt charges from Judge Torres. There is no version of this scenario where the Attorney General emerges without damage. 48 hours ago, Donald Trump was managing this situation through legal delay tactics, the playbook that has defined his entire relationship with accountability for 5 decades. Today, the situation is managing him. The power shifted at 9:42 a.m., and it hasn't shifted back. Regardless of what happens at midnight Sunday, whether Donald Trump complies or defies, American constitutional law has already been permanently, irreversibly altered by his own choices. Judge Torres' ruling is in the federal record. It cannot be unwritten. It will be cited in every future case involving presidential authority for the next century. Before this week, a president who defied federal court orders faced a contempt finding a political headache, manageable, survivable, something to be spun at campaign rallies as fighting for executive authority. After this week, a president who defies court orders faces the suspension of the authority itself, the removal of power, not a fine, not a political problem, an actual operational consequence. The calculation changed permanently because Donald Trump pushed too far. And here is the bitter, almost poetic irony of this moment. Donald Trump handed the judicial branch a weapon it has never possessed before. Not his enemies, not a political opponent. He did it himself through his contempt, his obstruction, his arrogant, decades-long certainty that the rules of American society were written for everyone except him. He walked into a federal court subpoena, chose maximum defiance at every turn, and gave Judge Torres the legal foundation to go further than any court in history has ever gone. He thought he was fighting a judge. He was drafting the next 100 years of constitutional law, and his name will be attached to it forever. The American constitutional system has always rested on a silent assumption that all three branches will voluntarily respect each other's authority, that the executive won't push so far that the judiciary has to physically take power away. What happens when someone stops agreeing? This week answered that question. Courts don't just bark, they bite. They reach into the executive branch and take the power itself. Nixon tested the system during Watergate. He complied. Clinton tested the system during his impeachment. He complied. This is the real test, and Donald Trump isn't passing it. This week proved that the constitutional system can survive a president who genuinely believes he is above the law. But the warning written in the margins of this ruling is clear. The system held this week because one judge was willing to go further than any judge in history, and because institutions under extraordinary pressure chose law over loyalty to one man's ego. That is not a guarantee. That is not a promise about next time. The question this week leaves us with is not whether the system worked. The question is, will we protect the people who made it work? Will we demand that the next person who sits behind that desk in the Oval Office understands before they're sworn in that the office comes with limits, that no president is above the law, that in America, no one is? This week, one federal judge proved it. The rest is up to us. At 9:42 a.m. this morning, American constitutional history changed. A federal judge suspended a sitting president's executive authority. Markets crashed. Congress convened an emergency session. The international press broke into regular programming. And the man who spent years telling the world he was untouchable discovered that the American legal system, slow, imperfect, and stressed to its absolute limit, still has one answer for anyone who decides the rules don't apply to them. Yes, they do. This ruling will be studied in law schools, debated in Congress, and cited in courtrooms for the next 100 years. Whatever happens Sunday night, whatever Donald Trump's lawyers file next, whatever political deal gets negotiated in the back rooms of Capitol Hill this week is already permanent. The precedent is set. The legal record exists. If this breakdown gave you something, the news cycle didn't, the actual stakes, not the spin, drop a comment below. Tell us what you think happens next. Subscribe to American Flashpoint today if you want to be here when it does. This story isn't over, not even close.